The emergency room at St. Jude's was a storm of sterile steel and frantic alarms. Machines chirped, voices overlapped, and the heavy scent of antiseptic filled the air. A critical patient was rushed in, heart rate erratic, breathing shallow. The clock was ticking down to 0 when Elena Ward, a quiet nurse in blue scrubs, stepped forward to assist. A man standing nearby lost his grip on reality. He barked a question that silenced the room. "Do you even know what you're doing?" Elena didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply went to work. Minutes later, truth arrived. The master revealed. History made. Elena Ward was 32 years old, and in the high-stakes, adrenaline-soaked world of the emergency ward, she was essentially a ghost. She worked the graveyard shifts where the air was always heavy with the unspoken weight of broken stories and the persistent, rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors. To her colleagues, Elena was just a reliable regular, a quiet woman in navy blue scrubs who finished her charts with obsessive precision and never joined the loud, ego-driven banter that usually filled the break room during the 2 a.m. lull. They saw her as competent, yes, but effectively invisible, a background character in a theater dominated by surgical gods who thrived on the authority of their white coats. The ER tonight was a masterpiece of managed chaos. The city outside was breathing a heavy, humid heat, and the influx of patients was pushing the facility to its absolute breaking point. The air inside smelled of ozone, blood, and the metallic tang of hospital-grade floor cleaner. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low-frequency buzz that most people ignored. But to Elena, it was the rhythmic pulse of a system under extreme strain. She moved through the hallways with a grace that suggested she was measuring the atmospheric pressure of the room rather than just walking through it. She had arrived 90 minutes early for her shift, a habit formed in much harsher environments where the first few seconds defined the final outcome. She spent that time in the supply room, not just counting gauze, but feeling the weight and balance of every instrument. She knew that a retractor with a microscopic loose screw could cost a surgeon 3 seconds of focus, and 3 seconds in the red zone could be the difference between a pulse and a flatline. To Elena, the hospital was a machine, and every part had to be calibrated for survival. She moved with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, her mind already running through the potential complications of the night. A sudden hemorrhage, a calcified artery, or a reaction to the trauma meds. She was a creature of total awareness, operating in a frequency that others were too busy to hear. A critical case had just arrived. A middle-aged man with a complex, multi-system trauma after a structural collapse at a construction site. The team swarmed the gurney immediately, their voices rising in a frantic, hot report. Standing in the middle of the storm was a man named Mark, the patient's brother. Mark was terrified. He was sweating, and his eyes were darting around the room, searching for someone to blame for the tragedy unfolding before him. In his world, noise was power. He didn't understand the language of the silence. He looked at the frantic residents and the high-tech equipment, his mind searching for a hero in a white coat, completely ignoring the woman who was actually holding the perimeter. In a crisis, fear often masquerades as aggression. Mark was redlining, a psychological state where the brain, overwhelmed by too many conflicting signals, starts to prioritize the loudest noise. He saw the young residents fumbling with the lines. He saw the chaos. And when Elena stepped in to adjust the thoracic monitor and check the patient's subcostal response, she became the target for his mounting panic. He saw a woman in scrubs, without the divine white coat of a doctor, and he assumed she was the weak link in the chain. He didn't see the scars on her hands or the stillness in her soul. He only saw a title he deemed inferior. "Hey, stay away from him," Mark shouted, his voice cracking like a whip across the sterile bay. "I haven't seen a doctor touch him in 5 minutes. Do you even know what you're doing? Or are you just here to push buttons and wait for instructions?" The room went stone cold. The other nurses looked down at their shoes, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge a grieving relative's vocal authority in the middle of a code. The junior resident, Dr. Miller, froze for a split second, caught between his own technical struggle and the man's outburst. Every eye in the crowded ward turned toward Elena. expecting a defense, expecting an apology, or perhaps a display of hurt feelings. Elena didn't react with a shout of her own. She didn't blush, and she certainly didn't try to defend her decade of elite trauma experience. She simply finished the adjustment on the screen with a hand that was as steady as a mountain, her green eyes remaining locked on the data stream. She didn't explain that she was a senior clinical coordinator or that she had authored the very manuals Mark was currently misinterpreting. She simply nodded once, a gesture of professional acknowledgement of his pain, and retreated into the rhythm of the work. She knew they were judging her by her silence. Mark assumed that because she wasn't arguing, she was admitting her own inadequacy. In his world, value was measured by volume. In Elena's world, it was measured by the life that stayed in the body. She was the anchor the room was too blind to see, waiting for the moment when the noise would finally fail. And she knew that moment was coming in exactly 3 minutes. She was the code whisperer, and the machine was about to break. If you think people under pressure sometimes say things they don't mean, comment, "That is unfair." The trauma bay was now vibrating with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. Dr. Miller was moving with a heroic speed that would have looked impressive on a TV drama, but to Elena, it looked like a train wreck in slow motion. The team was doing everything by the book, following the standard algorithms taught in every residency program. But they were reading the wrong chapter for a man who had been subjected to the specific atmospheric pressures of a structural collapse. The expert paradox was unfolding in real time. The more Miller tried to control the situation with volume, the more he lost the patient. The room was filled with the smell of burnt jet fuel and the metallic tang of fear. The patient, Thomas, was beginning to drift into the deep shadow. His breathing was becoming a ragged, wet sound that signaled the onset of a refractory shock loop. To Miller and his team, this looked like a simple respiratory failure. They prepared to force the intubation, which would have been a lethal mistake in Thomas's current state. The beeping of the EKG was becoming a frantic, rhythmic plea for help that no one was translating correctly. The medical fog of war had descended on the room, blinding the specialist to the nuance of the injury. They were looking at the monitors, but they were ignoring the man. Mark was still standing near the wall, his chest heaving as he watched the doctor struggle. He was still convinced that Elena was the problem. "Someone get her out of here," he hissed to a passing attendant. "She's just standing there while my brother dies. We need real help. We need the best." He was looking for a hero with a white coat, ignoring the master with the truth who was standing 3 feet away. He was drowning in his own insecurity, projecting his helplessness onto the only person who actually had a plan. Elena watched from the perimeter, her mind running through a high-speed simulation of the patient's internal anatomy. She saw the lag in the monitors that the doctors were ignoring. She saw Thomas's fingernails turning a bruised purple, a sign of silent cyanosis. It was a sign that the oxygen wasn't just low, it was being physically blocked by internal atmospheric pressure that the intubation wouldn't fix. She noticed a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch in Thomas's jaw, not a seizure, but a pressure reflex. He was fighting to keep his own airway open against an internal force the doctors didn't believe existed. She wanted to speak. She saw the 3-millimeter lag in the rise of the right chest wall. It wasn't a heart problem. It was a tension leak from the collapse, and the window was closing fast. But she remembered Mark's insult. "Do you even know what you're doing?" She knew that if she spoke now, Miller would only shout louder to cover his own growing insecurity, and Mark would escalate the drama. She realized that speed without awareness is just a faster way to fail. She was the conductor of a dying orchestra, waiting for the first chair to miss a note. The atmosphere was becoming toxic with ego and misplaced urgency. The medics were relying on their confidence as armor, refusing to believe that a nurse could see something they missed. They were ignoring the warnings because listening would mean admitting they didn't have total control over the fate of their patient. The room was full of experts, yet no one was listening to the heartbeat. The air in the bay felt thick, almost stagnant, as if the oxygen itself were waiting for someone to take command. Every second was a brick being added to a wall of inevitable failure. Elena realized that the golden hour was shrinking to a silver minute. Thomas's eyes fluttered, his consciousness slipping away as his heart entered a refractory loop. If they pushed that secondary sedative now, his heart would enter a shock reflex loop it won't come back from. Every microsecond was a heartbeat lost to the noise. The room was still shouting at the wind, while the master was ready in the shadows. She took one deep, rhythmic breath and prepared to unlock the door. The shadow raven was about to take flight. She reached into the utility cart behind her and quietly prepped a specialized microdriver in a decompression kit, keeping it hidden in the palm of her hand. She wasn't waiting for permission anymore. She was waiting for the moment when the truth would become the only currency that mattered. She was the code whisperer, and she was about to play the most important movement of her life. If you realize that stress can make us miss what matters, comment, "I was wrong." The shift happened at exactly 2:18 a.m. Thomas's breathing suddenly hitched, a sharp, wet sound that cut through the chatter of the room like a gunshot. His eyes snapped open, wide, terrifyingly clear, and full of the raw, unfiltered adrenaline of a man who knows he is drowning on dry land. The heart monitor began a high-pitched, discordant scream as his heart rate bottomed out. "Code Blue, he's arresting!" Miller shouted. But it wasn't an arrest. It was a lockout, a mechanical failure of the body that required a physical correction, not a drug. Dr. Miller froze, his hands hovering over the patient's chest like a pianist who had forgotten the next note. The silence that followed the alarm was deafening. The system had failed, and the experts were finally running out of noise. Mark's face turned from anger to a gray, hollow mask of realization. "Thomas," he whispered, his voice small and terrified. "Thomas, no!" The ego had finally run out of oxygen, and the reality of the end was setting in. This was the moment of the reversal. Elena Carter didn't waste a heartbeat on an apology or a smug look. She didn't look at Mark for validation. She didn't need a salute. She simply stepped out of the shadows and into the center of the light with a speed and intent that made the residents stop and breathe. She was no longer a nurse. She was the commanding officer of the room. Her hands, previously tucked away, were now moving with a predatory efficiency. She moved with a laminar flow that made the previous chaos look like static on an old television. "Dr. Miller, stop the sedative push immediately," Elena commanded. Her voice wasn't a shout, but it had a density that cut through the room like a laser through fog. "He's not in respiratory failure. It's a diaphragmatic tension lock from the crush trauma. The saline you're pushing is drowning his heart. Back off the gurney. All of you. Now." The sheer authority in her voice bypassed Miller's ego entirely. He took 2 steps back, his hands trembling. Elena knelt over Thomas, her hands moving with a mechanical, cold precision. 1. Identifying the fault point. She didn't perform a whole new surgery. She just fixed the point of failure. She felt the space between the second and third ribs with a mechanical, cold precision. "I noticed the subcostal lag 40 minutes ago," she said, her voice a calm, rhythmic drone designed to lower the room's heart rate. She wasn't just managing a body, she was managing the entire atmosphere of the room. She was the governor of the engine, preventing it from blowing itself apart. 2. The surgical correction. She drove the needle into the chest wall with a sharp, practiced thrust. A sharp, audible hiss of trapped air, like a tire blowing out, whistled out of Thomas's chest. It was the sound of a life returning. On the monitor, the flat line began to spike instantly. 10, 20, 60, 80. Thomas gasped, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, healthy peak for the first time in an hour. It was the sound of a soul returning to its vessel. The room seemed to exhale in unison. 3. Synchronizing the team. "Miller, adjust the PEEP to 10 and titrate the O2 to 5 liters. Now." It wasn't a request, it was a directive from a higher authority. Miller, terrified and humbled, obeyed instantly. His ego completely vanished in the presence of a master. He realized he wasn't looking at a subordinate. He was looking at the person who was keeping his career from ending in a tragedy. The team fell into a synchronized rhythm, their movements guided by her steady cadence. In those few minutes, the trauma bay was a masterclass in clinical perfection. The situation was stabilized. The patient was coming back from the abyss. Elena stood by the bed, her hands steady, her expression as neutral as a stone wall. She had dismantled the room's ego-driven hierarchy in under 60 seconds. Not by shouting louder, but by being the only person who knew the rhythm of the storm. Truth had been served with surgical precision. Mark stood in the corner, his jaw practically hitting the floor. He watched the woman he had insulted, the woman he had mocked, straighten the world when it started to tilt toward tragedy. He heard the senior attending surgeon, who had just walked in, say 4 words that changed his life forever. "Good call, Elena," the chief said, looking at the needle. "I didn't think anyone else on this shift knew the Shadow Raven protocols. Miller, you're lucky she was watching the baseline when you were watching the spotlight. You were just too busy looking at her scrubs to see her rank." The truth hit the room like a physical blow. The invisible nurse was a master in a world the residents were still trying to learn. She wasn't standing in the corner because she was weak. She was standing there because she was the anchor. Mark realized that his insults had been a shield for his own ignorance, and that the woman he had disrespected was the only reason his brother was still breathing. Truth had been served, and the mountain had bowed to the shadow. The master had spoken. If you believe actions speak louder than words, comment, "I am indebted." The remainder of the shift passed in a heavy, reflective silence that hung over the trauma wing like a protective shroud. Thomas was moved to the ICU with strong vitals and a clear path to recovery. The tension in the bay had faded, replaced by a strange, quiet energy as the staff began to clean up the wreckage of the crisis. The medical fog of war had lifted, leaving behind the wreckage of broken assumptions. The nurses moved differently now, their posture straighter, their focus sharper. The hospital at 4 a.m. is a strange, liminal space where the line between life and death feels remarkably thin. Elena stood at the nursing station, finally letting the full weight of her exhaustion take hold of her frame. She was drinking a cup of lukewarm tea, her eyes fixed on the empty chair across from her. She wasn't replaying her success. She was already analyzing the next transition. To her, the Shadow Raven moment was just a necessary adjustment in a failing system, a correction in the flow of time. Mark approached the station slowly. His earlier aggression was gone, replaced by a profound, trembling humility. He stopped a few feet away, looking at his boots for a long moment before finding the courage to speak. He was a man who prided himself on recognizing power, yet he had missed the most powerful person in the room because of a pair of scrubs. The shame was a physical weight on his shoulders. "Nurse Elena," Mark whispered, his voice shaky and stripped of its earlier booming authority. She stopped her work and turned with a slow, deliberate movement. "Yes? I wanted to come over and apologize," Mark said, his eyes finally meeting hers. "I was way out of line. I was looking for someone to shout at because I was scared. I had no idea who I was talking to. I was looking at the scrubs and the silence. I wasn't looking at the eyes. You saved my brother when I was trying to kick you out. I'm so sorry, I was blind." Elena looked at the man, her expression as neutral as a stone wall for a heartbeat, and then it softened. Just a fraction. "It's okay, Mark. Pressure makes everyone a little short-sighted. Just remember, the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one with the answer. Next time, look at the hands. The hands of a master don't shake, even when the world is screaming." She realized that his apology was for himself as much as for her, a way to mend the fracture in his own character. Mark winced at the truth of her words. He realized that her confidence wasn't a lack of interest in the room. It was a profound, terrifying competence that didn't need his validation. He felt like a trainee standing before a general whose battlefield was the human heart. He saw the depths of the ocean she lived in, and he realized he had only been splashing in the shallows. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You wouldn't have heard me," Elena replied simply. "You were too busy listening to your own fear. Sometimes the noise has to stop on its own before the truth can be heard." Fortunately for your brother, he recognized the rhythm before the music ended. He knew the silence of the master. As Mark finally walked back toward the waiting room, the staff watched him go, then turned their eyes back to Elena. She was no longer invisible. She was the fixed point, the anchor, the ghost who had straightened the world. The "just a nurse" label had been stripped away, revealing the steel beneath. She was the code whisperer, and her mission was complete. As she walked out of the surgical wing that evening, the morning sun painting the city in shades of gold, the staff watched her go with a new kind of reverence. They didn't see just a nurse anymore. They saw the raven, the one who watches the threshold. If you believe understanding leads to respect, comment, "I will live kindly." The story of Elena Ward is a vital, enduring reminder that true greatness is often found in the people we choose not to notice. We live in a world that is obsessed with stars, the ones who take up the most space, the ones who shout the loudest into microphones, and the ones who crave the bright spotlight for their own ego and validation. We assume that because someone is quiet, they have nothing to say, and because someone is in the background, they have nothing to offer the front lines. We think that to be important, we must have a prestigious title, a loud voice, or a formal uniform that commands respect. But the real anchors of our society, the people who actually hold the fabric of our world together when the storms hit, are often the ones who say the least. They are the ones who master their craft in the deep shadows of the medical wings, the night shifts, and the quiet corners of the world. They are the ones who understand that real impact is a service, not a status symbol. They are the ones who understand that a title on a door doesn't save a life, but a steady hand on a pulse does. Expertise isn't a title you put on a business card or a LinkedIn profile. It's a level of awareness that allows you to see the shadow pattern in the middle of a storm. It's the rare ability to keep your pulse steady and your mind clear when everyone else's is racing at 100 beats per minute. Elena didn't win an argument with Mark. She simply waited for the moment when the truth became the only thing left on the table. She understood that leadership is about maintaining internal order when the external world is in chaos. Her silence was a weapon of absolute concentration. Value doesn't lie in your position on an organizational chart or the letters after your name. It lies in your perspective. Elena didn't know more than the surgeons in terms of academic theory. She simply saw the reality differently. She saw the connections between the dots that everyone else was treating as isolated incidents. She understood that in a crisis, the person closest to the problem is often the one with the most valuable information, provided they have the courage to speak up when it matters most. She was the anchor that the wind couldn't move. She was the raven. Elena Ward wasn't a superhero with a cape. She was a professional who refused to let her position define her contribution. She dared to stay silent when the room was full of noise, and she dared to act when the noise, koi kung, failed. She showed that the most powerful thing in a room is a mind that is clear of noise. Her silence was her strength, and her strength was the patient's salvation. She proved that true authority comes from within, not from the approval of the crowd. The next time you find yourself in a room where the experts are failing and the noise is deafening, look for the person in the corner who has been watching the baseline. Look for the quiet observer who has seen the patterns that others deem too small to notice. They might just be the master you need to get home alive. They might just be the only reason the whole world keeps spinning while you are asleep in your bed. Real strength is quiet. Real leadership is clear. And real heroes don't care if you ever know their names. They only care that the mission is complete and the people are safe in their beds. Be the observer. Be the master of the detail. Be the truth. Let your actions be the only announcement you ever need to make. Be the lighthouse. Because in the end, it's not what people say of a band that defines your legacy. It's what the world becomes because you were Joe. Even if you stayed in the shadows until you were called to reveal who you were, that is the power of the silent professional. And that is the lasting lesson of the disrespected nurse. A story written in silence and saved in a heartbeat. True mastery never needs a stage. It just needs a moment. If you believe the people who stay calm under pressure and let their actions speak or deserve recognition, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that respect is earned in moments, not demanded, don't forget to subscribe for more.